And you mentioned Joe Rogan before. You and he are grouped together in this sort of new constellation of the intellectual dark web. What do you see as what do you make of your kind of inclusion in this, and what do you see as its role going forward in the cultural conversation?
Well, it's like a herd of cats, right? Because, so I've thought about, well, what unites us to the degree that there's an us, because that's not so self-evident. There's enough of an us so that the name emerged and it's stuck. So there's something in common, because otherwise the name wouldn't have stuck, right? You can't name nothing. It doesn't work. And I've talked a fair bit about this with Dave Rubin, because Dave Rubin and I have been touring together, right? He opens my discussions and adds a nice comedic touch to them. And so what do we have in common? Everybody in the group is an independent practitioner, so an entrepreneur essentially, with their own media enterprise that's autonomous. None of us are serving any master except the audience. And we're all somewhat independent financially as a consequence of that. And so that makes us beholden to no master. All of us are engaged in these long-form discussions, right? And one of the consequences of being engaged in a long-form discussion is that you can assume that your audience is intelligent. And so that's another thing that unites everybody in the group, is we all assume that our audience is intelligent. But I think that that's not so much a consequence of any particular moral virtue on our parts, but an observation that the technology has made possible. It's like, and you can see this, I would say, particularly with Rogan, because in some sense he's a trailblazer in this domain. It's like, turns out my audience will listen to a 3-hour discussion. But he wouldn't have been able to discover that without the technology, right? So now, to his credit, he was smart enough to discover it and smart enough to notice it when he discovered it. And so, I think that also characterizes the rest of the people in this group. It's like, look at that. The audience actually wants, our listeners, let's say, and viewers, want detailed, in-depth, unscripted, spontaneous, meaningful conversation. And then are willing to go in that direction. That's the risk-taking element. Like, I can give you an example of that. So I just did 4 talks with Sam Harris, who's often grouped into this group as well, on the relationship between science and religion, say, or facts and values. That's another way of thinking about it, with a bit of politics thrown in, discussion of left-right differences and so on. What's the willingness to take the risk? Well, I had no idea when I met Sam in Vancouver, which was where the first 2 of the 4 talks were held. I'd never met him before. We did 2 podcasts together, one of which was we got locked in. The other one, which was more productive, I would say. But I had no idea if he and I could talk. But we were willing to, I guess that's right, agreed to take the risk to see if we could talk in a public forum. And I think that's another thing that characterizes the people in that group, is that they will take those sorts of risks. If you go into a television studio, a classic television studio, all the conversation is scripted. And it's actually quite frustrating, because you can't have a conversation with the journalist, because the journalist isn't there. Who's there is a frontispiece for the organization. And the organization has scripted all their responses. And so it's not actually like talking to a person. It's really like talking to a puppet. So for better or for worse. But in these unscripted long-form conversations, then you can take the risk of having a conversation, and that can go spectacularly well, but it can also fail dismally. So I would say those are the things that unite us to the degree that the group exists. I mean, I was in LA a week ago, and about 7 of us got together for dinner. And that was the first time we'd met as anything approximating a group. And, it was interesting to watch everybody interact, because, as I said, it really is a herd of cats. There's tremendous diversity of political opinion and a tremendous diversity of personality, like Eric Weinstein and Joe Rogan. Like, they're not even members of the same species in some ways, So so it's a very fractious group. But I think those things that I outlined are the elements that basically unite it.
There's also something that I sense watching some of the discussions. There's a kind of intellectual curiosity and a sense of people thinking in public. And there's also a sense of maybe the potential for people to change their minds or to discover things during the conversation.
Yeah, well, that's partly the appreciation of the intelligence of the audience. It's like, and I would say it is actually the manifestation of the process of thinking that's more important than the conclusions that are generated. Even in these discussions that I've been having with Harris, like we are trying to argue out two different viewpoints, because Harris believes that values can be derived with unerring precision in some sense, using the proper methodology from facts. And I believe that it's more complicated than that there has to be intermediating structures, and that those are really narrative in their nature. So there's a technical argument, as well as a variety of sub-arguments about the relative role of traditional religion and so forth. But the outcome of the debate about those issues is partly what people are coming to the talks to see, to determine what should the conclusions be. But a much larger part, perhaps, is to observe and engage, at least by proxy, in the process of dialogue. And that's more important, because dialogue is the process by which complex problems are solved, which is what makes me a free speech advocate fundamentally. Well, it's not an advocate. It's like I realize that the protection for free speech is protection of the mechanism whereby complex social problems are solved. And we're the people in this group, and many other people as well, are acting out that dialogical process. And people are happy about that, as they should be.
And I read a Spectator review of your recent conversation. I think you've now come to the end of your debates with Sam Harris. And they said that you expressed a little bit of irritation at when Sam didn't grasp some of the points that you were making, or that you didn't fully appreciate that he'd understood them. I also think that Sam Harris in particular, like he's built a whole kind of personality, career, several books on this atheism position. Do you think that he can argue in good faith from that perspective? Could he turn around and say, well, actually, no, you're right, Jordan, this atheism thing is a bit simplistic?
No, I think he was conducting the discussion in good faith. I actually think that what Sam is doing is a good faith project. You know, I think there's conceptual muddiness about it. But, you know, his basic premise is that we could come to an agreement that working to reduce unnecessary misery and suffering is a universal good. It's like, okay, fair enough. That seems like a reasonable proposition. I don't think it's a proposition of fact, and he claims that it is, but that doesn't matter. Still, it's fair enough, man. And then, you know, so that's one proposition. Another proposition is, it would be really good if our systems of value weren't founded on error. And what do we have that's not error? Well, we have facts. We have objective facts. I mean, look at the technology. Look at what we've done with our science. It's like, you don't want to underestimate the utility of objective facts. So maybe we can ground the value structure in the facts. It's like, well, that would be good if we could do it. So, and then his ethic, let's say, is an amalgam of those two propositions. And I think that his project is honorable, and I think he's committed to it. He also, rightly, is concerned with the dangers of the fundamentalist dangers of revealed truth, and so is very skeptical about the axiomatic claims of dogmatic religion. It's like, yeah, fair enough. But the mechanisms that he outlines to derive values from facts are insufficient in my estimation. I don't think that his argument is sufficiently sophisticated, even though I don't doubt I don't think that Sam is any less committed to an ethical good. It's not obvious to me that he is than I am, you know, and he's argued and discussed fully in good faith as far as I'm concerned, with the odd error, because no one is negotiating 100% all the time in good faith. I mean, that's a standard that no one can achieve. But I think the discussions have been unbelievably productive, and we'll see that certainly the crowds are responding. I don't think the crowds would have been engaged if Sam wouldn't have been discussing in good faith, because the engagement is actually an indication that a good faith discussion is occurring. Otherwise, it gets dull very, very rapidly. We'll see what happens when the videos are released, and that'll be in August once the sound is edited and all of that, and then people will have a public debate about how the discussion proceeded. I also think that each discussion built on the previous one, and that I think we both ended up more informed and more articulate than we started out. So that's a really good thing. I certainly understand his arguments much better than I did, a year ago, let's say.